Our special guest, our special friend Sue Verhoff is here to introduce our guest speaker for today. Everybody knows and loves Sue, so it's appropriate that she would introduce our speaker. Thank you.
It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Maureen and I go back a long way. We've known each other for years and years. Our families have grown up together, and I could tell you all kinds of stories about her. But I'm here to introduce her professionally and want to let you know that she grew up just outside Boston, Massachusetts. She's always had a great love of history, facilitated by school field trips to the USS Constitution and Plymouth Plantation and other places of historic significance. When she was 17, she gained a further interest in her own family history and has been doing family history ever since. One of the branches of her family tree includes a great uncle who was Naval Aviator number 224 in Pensacola in 1917. In 2011, she graduated from Clayton State University with a BA in History and a minor in English, currently working on her master's in education with a media certificate, and is employed by Clayton County Public Schools. But on a much more personal level for all of us in this room, Maureen is the one who is listening to every single moment of all 730 some odd Veterans History Project interviews in our collection, and is cataloging them and putting them online. So if you want to know about Keillor, you can find Milton Jones' interview. If you want to know about Way, you can find Tom Gay's interview, and so on. So I'm very grateful for her help there. Her co-author, son Richard Keillor, is a Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy, served 3 deployments, all aboard the carriers Enterprise, the Stennis, and the Bush. Until December of 2013, he was LCPO at NATTC aboard NAS Pensacola, and that's a lot of acronyms for you. He, in June 2016, graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University with a degree in aeronautic engineering, currently LCPO at Det VMTT 204 at MCAS New River, North Carolina. Maureen.
Thank you very, very much. Am I too short? Okay. Before I say a word, I would like to sincerely thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service. I appreciate it very much. Am I up? I guess I need to. All right. Hey, yay. I want to tell you that we are a military family. Yay, it's working. I love it. The Zoomie over there on the left has since retired from the Air Force, but he's a satellite imagery analyst at Wright-Patt Air Force Base. Very excited, getting ready to go to Molesworth, England in June. And the Swabby on the right is now Chief Swabby, thank you very much, and he's the one we talked about that's down at New River. We were fortunate enough, if anyone ever says to you, would you like to go on a Tiger cruise, jump with both feet. The most amazing trip I've ever been on. That's Lisbon, Portugal behind us, and you can see a big hunk of metal also behind us. That's the tail end business of an F-18. That attire we're wearing smells 10 times worse than it looks. It's covered in jet fuel, grease, and body odor. Because they can't be washed, they have that special mechanism that makes it go poof if you hit the water. Anyway, but I was so honored to be able to wear it. And yes, that is me, and the tail end of that aircraft is hanging 13 stories up over the edge of the carrier, but I still sat there. This is an Ohio tradition where you wear that shirt in an exotic place and have it, but you can see that the ship we sailed on is the Big E, the Enterprise. It was one of its last deployments before decommissioning. Oops, I went too far. There's my blueberry in the pea soup over there at MCAS New River. Very proud of him. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly transition from that one to, sorry for inflicting all my grandchildren on you. And the machine is going slowly. Here we go. All right. So, because I'm a history major, I'm going to set the historical stage for you a little bit here. In 1911, Theodore Ellison decided to shoot off the edge of a boat that was reconfigured to be an aircraft carrier. Fast forward to 1914. In history at that time, World War I had just begun in Europe. Woodrow Wilson was president. The first red and green traffic lights were in use. A stamp cost you 2 cents. Babe Ruth just debuted with the Boston Red Sox. And the Boston Braves had just won the World Series. Wrigley Field opened in Chicago. The Signal Corps of the United States Army was launched. There were 48 stars on the flag because Arizona and New Mexico had just been added. Women would not vote for another 20 years. And Henry Ford's assembly line had been in operation for a year. All right, so that's the history of what's going on here. And in 1914, I'm getting used to knowing that you're seeing what I'm seeing. 1914, Ellison had gone off, and things were going on in San Diego, but they were trying to get an aviation school going at Annapolis. And if you've ever been to Maryland in the wintertime, you'll know that was not a good idea, right? So they cast about, where are we going to go? Oh, wait, there's a Navy yard that's been abandoned for a couple of years down there in Pensacola. Better weather year-round, let's go down there. So in 1914, that is the USS Mississippi BB-23, the first station ship, and some early planes. They took 14 pilots, 23 men, and off they go. This is the first in naval aviation. This is a little brouhaha had gone on in Mexico, and they sent some naval aviators down there to mostly do, you know, I'm getting to those senior moments. Reconnaissance. Thank you for being my brain cells. To do some reconnaissance, and this was the first time they ever took hits while they were up there flying. So that was a first for naval aviation. I don't know if you can read what it says there, but it says Lieutenant Bronson, wind about 5 miles an hour, elevator considerably down. Do we have any pilots in the room? I'm thinking your elevator down when you're trying to get off a boat is not a good idea. No, okay. So these are some of the early attempts in Pensacola to get things moving. This was officially called the crash sled. They called it the solo coffin because you had to fly the same course that it went in the water, because a lot of the cause of deaths with these early pilots was drowning. It wasn't the impact, it was drowning because they would get tangled up in the wreckage. So you flew around and the crash sled flew around together so that if you did go down, they would be able to get you out, hopefully before you drown. I think I have some Navy personnel in here because I see some of them grinning and shaking their heads. So this barge was called the Mary Ann after somebody's daughter, and it was on pontoons with a big old crane because they also found out that towing the wreckage of an aircraft through the water to get it back on shore was doing more damage than the actual crash did. So this is the Mary Ann. And this was one of my favorite photographs because the caption on the back says, "Kelly Upton stubs his toe, Mary Ann to the rescue." And I'm sure that that was not a unique event. All right, have you ever tried to tell a Marine, it can't be done? All right. They told the Marine, you can't do a loop in this aircraft. And when I saw this picture in the files at the museum, it's actually labeled upside down. But if you look at the buildings down there on the ground, this photograph is correct. It's the plane that's upside down. So this lieutenant said, you know what, I'm going to try it. It took him 3 or 4 tries, and what he learned about spin and stall issues is still being taught there in Pensacola today. So, neat guy. Another thing that was going on in Pensacola at the same time were dirigibles, which were used as reconnaissance, but sometimes were kind of like a, hey, here we are. So that didn't last very long. And that ship there was known as an Eagle ship. It was used to patrol the coast during World War I, and Henry Ford was behind the assembly line style production of these ships. I have to read you this caption because I love the way sailors are always able to adapt, improvise, and overcome. So I'm going to read you this caption. Somebody sent this home as a postcard, and it says, "On our way to the war gone, our reading room on the boat deck under the blue sky and on the blue sea." Anybody ever been catapulted off of a, okay, all right. This was how they did it in the early days. They strapped your plane to this thing, and shot you off the end of that rail. And I'm guessing that you hoped that the straps came off as you got to the end of that rail. Okay? These are the guys that came before you, right? And then here's a little bit different view, but that's how it worked. Pretty amazing. Now, one of the things that they knew they were going to have to do when they got to Pensacola was they were going to have to be completely self-sufficient. If you've been to Pensacola, it's still on the backwater side, but 100 years ago, there was nothing there. And so they came with a machine shop and with plenty of propellers. Now, he is one of the reasons why I have such an interest in military history. This is my grandpa's oldest brother, Ned. He was, as Sue said, Naval Aviator number 224 in 1917. He lived until 1985. He stayed in the Naval Reserves till 1953. Wrap your head around that, from the very beginning of navigation to the jet age. I never knew that till after he died. So now, if you have not been to see that pretty lady at that blue tablecloth, don't be one of those guys whose descendant says, I would have loved to have sat at his feet for hours and listened to his stories. Now, I've been able to piece a lot together from his unit records, from interviewing his daughter, who's still alive. She's 92 in St. Louis. So I told her stuff she didn't know about her dad, and she told me stuff I didn't know about her dad. So we've been able to piece it together, but don't leave it like that. Don't leave your history to be pieced together. Go talk to Sue. All right, so we're moving ahead in history. We've still got the dirigible hangars there, but now we've got some more significant aircraft sitting there. We're right at the beginning of World War II. And ironically enough, the hangars, the dirigible hangars are still gone, but those brick hangars are still there. One's a basketball court and one's the PX, if you've ever been to Pensacola, if you ever want to go down there. Now, are there any survivors here of Dilbert the Dunker? Yay. You were strapped into this, if I get my facts straight here, and sledded down a 45-degree angle, and if I'm right, it went upside down, and you had to get out of it, and you had to swim out to the side, because a lot of times, if you came straight up, there's jet fuel and things, so you had to go out and up. I'm seeing some, good, I'm glad I've got my facts straight here. So that's Dilbert the Dunker, for those of you who have not survived him. Lots of radial engines sitting here waiting to be installed if necessary by women accepted for volunteer emergency service, otherwise known as WAVES in World War II. In Pensacola, not only did they do the maintaining, they also taught gunnery, they taught photography, and a lot of other things. They were 2%, I think, of the naval forces in World War II. This is the USS Ranger. It was the first ship to be built from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. A lot of older boats were kind of reconfigured, but this was the first one where they went, let's build an aircraft carrier. Now, if you look down at the aft end of this ship, you see 3 tubes protruding. Those were the smokestacks that would flip down for flight ops and back up for sailing. Now we're skipping even further ahead in time, based mostly on the cars, but this is early 50s maybe. In the background, the field there is Chevalier Field, which is where the earlier planes went, but it became woefully inadequate, especially as we reached the time of the jet age. Those strips were not long enough for jets. This was taken right after Forrest Sherman Field was built, and Forrest Sherman Field is the home of the Blue Angels. You can see over to the far right of the photograph, that's Chevalier Field, which is now the barracks for the students at the Naval Aviation Technical Training Command, that they're now Chevalier Hall. And he was an early naval aviator, neat guy, very fascinating. And the airstrip you see to the left of the photograph is Forrest Sherman Field, where the Blue Angels fly. This is I'm going to have to look at my numbered photographs. I was trying to do most of this from the cuff. All right, get my facts straight. This is the Lexington. relieving the Antietam as the training carrier for NAS Pensacola. You can see her being escorted by a team of tugs. And the Lexington was there for many, many years. They tried to keep her in Pensacola, but couldn't rustle up enough funds. Now she's a floating museum in Corpus Christi, Texas, if you ever get out that way. The Lady Lex has been preserved. You can still see her today. And here's another view where you can get an idea. If you've been to Pensacola Naval Air Station, you can get an idea of the sheer size of that ship, because that is Pensacola NAS in the background. If you've been to Pensacola, how many people got to go to see the museum? You went on a trip recently. Okay, so you see all these trees behind the lighthouse there. That's where the museum is today. You come right out of the museum, and there is the lighthouse, which is the oldest operating lighthouse on the Gulf Coast. This is one of my favorite buildings on base. You know, most bases number their buildings consecutively. This is still number 16. It was built in 1834. If you know anything about Pensacola history, the Confederates took over the Pensacola Navy Yard during the Civil War, but didn't hold on to it for very long because the Union forces kept Barrancas and McRae. Okay, so you've got this port that you can't get out of. So they demolished all of the buildings except Building 16 because it was, at the time, the chapel, although it's been used for many other purposes since then and before then. So thankfully, the Confederates left it standing. It's listed in one of Pensacola's list of haunted places. Apparently, there was a Marine aviator who liked to play poker there, and then he went out and was unfortunately killed. But the rumor has it you can still hear poker chips in this building. So the wet basin that was built way back when is still being used today. There are boats in this wet basin today that say United States Air Force. Wrap your head around that one. I haven't figured it out yet, but most of these buildings are gone. They've been lost mostly to hurricanes, but the smokestack, ironically enough, is still standing. This was Quarters A, which was where the base commander would stay. The caption said, "Well-dressed naval officer." Clearly he's out of uniform, but Nimitz and Halsey both called that place home. It looks like just a pond, and it was just a pond, freshwater pond, but have you ever heard of Naval Live Oak? Okay, I'm trying to keep this short, but this is a cool story. If you get to go down to Pensacola, you go to Naval Live Oaks, which is part of the National Park System. They have 3 blocks of wood of identical size. One is oak, one is white oak, one is Naval Live Oak. The oak one is kind of heavy. The white oak is a little heavier. And that Naval Live Oak is heavy. Why? Because the wood is denser. What ship was made from that Naval Live Oak? Say it. The Constitution. They call it Old Ironsides because that wood. Now, part of the process, and I don't understand it completely, maybe some woodworkers here can help us out. They would soak it, and this was the pond they soaked it in. This pond became Chevalier Field, and today it's under Chevalier Hall. It just was fascinating to me. Some of the hangars on inspection going on post-World War I during the drawdown. And I'd like to read you a quote. I marked it, glasses. Admiral William Benson wanted to rid the Navy of aviation as he did not conceive of any use the fleet will ever have for aviation. Fortunately, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy had other ideas. Anyone know who that Assistant Secretary of the Navy was? Very good. Get some gold stars for some foreheads here. All right, anybody know what a yeomanette is? Oh, I got you stumped. Female yeoman, that's exactly right. And when they wrote their orders out, they had to put yeoman F in parentheses because a few of the early yeomanettes got orders to go to sea in 1918. But they took over mainly office duties. And after the war was over, they went back to their regular lives. They got no military benefits afterwards. And then, of course, World War II changed a lot of things about women, didn't it? All right. Now, we are going to transition one more time So if you're tired of looking at my grandchildren, close your eyes. All right, we're going to talk about airplanes. And once again, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. The year is 1946. World War II is over on both fronts. Reduction in force, drawdown, okay. We've also got a little thing called the Air Force that's about to come in 1947, correct? Okay, I'm an Air Force mom, I gotta get that right. Nimitz, who's in charge of the Navy, sees the possibility of naval aviation getting muscled right out of the picture entirely. And he says, we need to showcase what the Navy can do, what naval aviation really can accomplish. So down the chain of command goes the instruction to let's put a demonstration team together, okay? So a World War II ace named Butch Voris, anybody heard of Butch Voris? If you're ever wondering what book you should read next, find a book called First Blue. It's the biography of Butch Voris, and he was the guy who was tasked with creating the Blue Angels flight demonstration team. At the time he didn't realize it, he thought he was just supposed to come up with a few ideas. And when I read the book First Blue, these sketches were scanned there. And when I got to go to Pensacola, one of the files they handed me was the files with his original sketches. It wasn't the Holy Grail for me, but it was really close. And one of his ideas was to simulate a World War II combat situation in the Pacific. And so they painted up, was it the Texan or the Jenny that looked a lot like a Japanese Zero? And they painted it up to look like one. And it was supposed to be a dogfight between the two. And the crewman in the Zero was supposed to toss out a dummy filled with sawdust on a parachute because they shot the plane down. Well, this photograph, see the guy with his thumb up there? That's Butch Voris trying to save his job. Because somehow the crewman that was supposed to toss the dummy out, I guess it got caught, but it got sent out late, and it landed just a few hundred feet from the admiral, and sawdust went everywhere. So that's Butch trying to keep his job, and the admiral apparently was in a pretty forgiving mood because he said, it's all right. He said, just make sure it lands further away next time. Their first flight as a team was at the Jacksonville Air Show, 47, I think, and they won the trophy for Best in Show, and Butch was a little surprised at that. The show at the time was only 17 minutes. Two of my favorite quotes from Butch Voris was that they practiced out over the Everglades so that if they fouled up, the alligators would eat the evidence. Which, you know, in the Navy, the chances of, anyway. And my other favorite quote is, people would ask how close they flew together. He said, well, if we hit each other, we're too close. If we don't, we're not close enough. And the trophy that they have there is still in the Blue Angels Ready Room, which thanks to a wonderful public affairs officer, I actually got to stand in front of and see and take a picture of. All right, you'll recognize this as, those of you who did get to go to the Air Museum, that's the Hellcat. It was the first plane, flew only for about a year, and then they transitioned to the Bearcat. I don't know why I don't have a picture in my presentation. I'm sorry, I don't have it on presentation mode. I'm just having too much fun up here, talking about airplanes and Navy. So the next plane after the Bearcat was, anybody know? The Panther. The Cougar came next. So for those of you who said Cougar, there they are, all in formation, smiling. I'd love to hear from you. Very interesting. Then we have next the Phantom. That's right, the Spook. Now the Phantom holds a very interesting distinction in that it was the only plane flown by both the Blues and the Air Force Thunderbirds. That's the only plane that they both have in common. All right, now how do you go over the Niagara Falls? Or in a formation of Skyhawks, which I think is kind of cool. That was the next plane they transitioned to. And then here they are in the Skyhawk flying over the Lexington, which was another, and then of course they went over to the Hornet, which my son was a maintainer on until he decided that let's work on the Osprey. Did you know that the Navy's transitioning to the Osprey for the Cod? That's, my son's running the program to teach the sailors to maintain the Osprey. So yeah, we're kind of proud of him a little bit. All right, so now we have the Hornet. And we have some maneuvers. This is the double farvel. Oh, see, I got a ringer back here. We'll forgive him. The double farvel, where we've got some guys upside down and some guys right side up, and how they do that fast. Did I miss the F-11? That's a distinct possibility. Before the Phantom. Well, one of the chapters in the book is the planes, so we'll have to double check that later. This formation is the echelon, which, if you know any French, that's the French word for ladder, which I thought was pretty cool. And of course, you cannot have a conversation about the Blue Angels without discussing Fat Albert. And I had a great series of email interviews with Lieutenant Ed Nafus, who flew the Constellation, and he provided this photograph from the book. He said she may have been the most ill-suited support plane the Blue Angels ever utilized, but she was a delight to fly with flexible wings that offered a smooth ride under most conditions, mostly because there just wasn't enough room in it for what they needed to carry. And then, of course, we have today's Fat Albert. And that plane, I've heard from people who have done some of the JATO assist takeoffs, and that it's almost like being in one of those F-18s. That is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, don't make them too technical, because I'm not a pilot, I'm a history geek. And if you want to talk to me about the F-11 or maintaining, I'll be back there at the table with Sue, because you're all going to crowd around her and sign up to get your interview done. All right, and if there are no, oh, there's a question.
I noticed there were 4 aircraft in the early pictures, and then they turned into 5. Can you talk about that transition or why?
Not sure why, and it was... This is the Navy we're talking about. I think some of it had to do with what they were trying to showcase, in other words, the maneuvers. Like today we have the Diamond and the Delta, okay? And so if the Diamond's flying, the slot pilots are out getting ready to sneak over behind the audience. So it might have to do with that, and it might have to, like what Butch Voris was showing, he had that extra, the Jenny or the Texan, I can never remember which, that was done up. The Texan, thank you. I'm glad there's people here to keep me straight and honest. So that may have something to do with it. And also, you know, there have been times in the Blue Angels history where there have been a hiatus for whatever reason. We had the Korean War, where most of the pilots became part of a unit called Satan's Kittens in Korea. Then we had, in the 70s, there was a time, you know, it wasn't a popular time to be in the military. We had a gas crisis. They also had a series of very bad crashes, several fatal crashes, and they had to regroup. And that's when they switched from being just a demonstration team to an actual official Navy squadron. And so that may have something to do with how many planes they're flying, but today it's pretty standard, those 6 aircraft. They actually have this, there's a 7th that's the PR plane, where they take community volunteers that have been specially nominated, and they also take members of the press up with them. And also, as a nod to the maintainers, they have never in their 70-plus year history had to cancel a show due to technical malfunctions. So, for the maintainers. Any other questions that yes, sir? Building 16 is not too far from the smokestack. It's near the post office. And it doesn't look like the photograph you saw. One of the chapters in This book, that piece of paper is just doomed. In this chapter, in this book, there's a chapter then and now. So the old picture is in there, and the current picture, today it's the JAG office, and it's got shutters all around, shuttered windows all around the floor. So it's near the post office. If you've got your DOD card, you can go back there, but now they've got that whole old section that I love so much. The John Q. public doesn't get to go back there. How am I doing for time? All right, excellent. Well, thank you for your interest, for your support, and I hope to talk to you back there.